Okay, I think I will start this lecture by Professor Denilson Lopes, who's a professor at the School of Communication at the Federal University. The lecture will be entitled "A Cold Shudder Walks All Over My Body," Mário Peixoto in England. So about the pioneer filmmaker Mário Peixoto. Before I start, however, could I just make a few notes, kind of housekeeping notes? Please keep your microphones and cameras off. Oh, they're automatically off, sorry. And accept a live transmission if required. And please post any questions and comments in the chat. I think there's a Q&A icon below the screen. The event is being recorded and will be disseminated at a future date, so be aware of that. But yes, please feel free to ask questions, and I will have to read your questions from the Q&A box. I'm Michael Asbury. I'm a reader at Chelsea College of Art, and I'm Deputy Director of the TrAIN Research Centre. So on behalf of the centre, I would like to welcome Professor Denilson Lopes. I will briefly introduce his extensive CV. So I'll try to summarize as best as I can, Denilson, if you don't mind. So Denilson Lopes is a professor at the School of Communication at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and a researcher funded by the CNPq and the FAPERJ. These are Brazilian state research funding bodies. He is the author of several books, including Mário Peixoto, Antes e Depois do Limite, Mário Peixoto Before and After Limite, Limite being the film that Mário Peixoto directed in if I'm not mistaken, 1931. I might be wrong about that date. Another one of his books is entitled Afetos, Experiências e Encontros com Filmes Brasileiros Contemporâneos, Effects, Experiences and Encounters with Contemporary Brazilian Films of 2016. Also, No Coração do Mundo, Paisagens Transculturais, or At the Heart of the World, Transcultural Landscapes of 2012. A Delicadeza, Estética, Experiência e Paisagens, The Delicateness, Aesthetics, Experience and Landscapes of 2007. O Homem que Amava Rapazes e Outros Ensaios, The Man Who Loved Young Men and Other Essays of 2002. Nós, os Mortos, Melancolia e Neobarroco, We, the Dead, Melancholy and the Neo-Baroque of 1999. And he also authored, together with André Antônio Barbosa, Pedro Pinheiro Neves, and Ricardo Duarte Filho, Inúteis, Frívolos e Distantes à Procura dos Dandies, Unuseful, Frivolous and Distant in the Search of Dandies in 2019. You know, so many publications. So it's with a great welcome that I pass the word to you, Denilson, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thanks, Michael, and I thanks all the also Paul and the colleagues from the center for the invitation, and also I want to thank Elise for the support. What I will present is a part of a current research on a certain Brazilian melancholic modernism. So any criticism, suggestion, or curiosity that you may have, please feel mostly welcome to do it. And I'm going to read, hopefully the image is fine, if I'm in the sound too. Just 1 second. So the title, or no, A Cold Shudder Walks Over All My Body, Mário Peixoto in England. And I'm going to put, let's see if it works. This is Mário Peixoto. So there was a boy. He was made a little odd, delicate, sad, and insecure, but he was no different to other boys of the same age. In 1926, he went to England. 1 year later, he came back. The spirit spent in England is neither metaphorical nor emblematic. It doesn't contain the experience of an entire lifetime. So, of what interest can this be? I would like to lend an ear to that young man at a time in which he had no clear idea of his future, which appears to have been the case that year. Undoubtedly, I would never found this boy if it had not been for Mário Peixoto's signature. But at that time, he was somebody else. No matter how much of this boy Mário Peixoto still carried within himself, some of it certainly transformed and was lost. I'm considering the school year he spent in England between 1926 and 1927, or more precisely, the pencil written diary he kept from January 1st, 1927, over 2 notebooks, the first leather bound with colorful pages. I can show you this is the first diary. It's called the Diary of England, that was written in English. And so he has also a second diary that was written in Portuguese that's called the Green Cadernos Verdes, Green Notebooks. No? So this diary that I'm going to talk more, it was when he went to study at a place called Hopeden College. And if I'm not mistaken, I never went there, so please correct me if I'm not very well in geography. But so Hopeden College, that's the village of Willingdon, close to Eastbourne in East Sussex, in the southeast of England. So what it was this diary that really interests me. So it was not an important year. It was not an important boy at this moment. So he was very young. He had this important name, a surname that I'll talk a little bit in some moments. So I would like to understand how it felt to be in 1927, to evoke Hans-Ulrich Gumbricht's desires relating to 1926, his book about this year. This is not simply a case of plunging into another moment or looking through the eyes of the other, but of establishing a dialogue through the sensation evoked by Mário, more than just ideologies or great historical facts, which in the end were mostly absent in his writing. Sensations that might have survived and that can tell us something about the fragments of his diary in its incompleteness and frailty. I do not intend, and this makes all the differences in relation to Gumbricht's proposal, to seek out a historical environment, his words, but I'm looking for what I can obtain from a single diary, a single body, and which in being private is not completely singular. More than 90 years after this trip, it was not possible to find any witness accounts. This on the horizon, but so far this has proven to be fairly improbable. Other than the biographical profile written by Saulo Pereira de Mello in Limite, and the biography of Mário Peixoto written by Emílio de Castro called Jogos de Armar, something like Arming Games, to date, I have not found any account by his contemporaries during his overseas trip, or even any letters, other than those included in Cadernos Verdes, the green notebooks, that the other diary that I've mentioned. The diary written by Mário Peixoto in Brazil before and after his trip to England. The few names of those that worked or studied Hopeden mentioned in Diário da Inglaterra, diaries in England, are unknown. Perhaps they are also already dead. No, it's quite so. Is what we are left with a historical fiction based on the diary of a young man that's fanciful from its start and mythomaniac at its worst. Not out of a wish to write fiction, but the need to construct that which could not exist in any other form. I'm guided by the diary by what he writes and suggests. I will not be discussing materialities through imaginaries and discourse, in which the subject is suppressed, but equally will not focus solely on one subject. I do not wish to incorporate Mário Peixoto nor emulate his style. I am in the interval between that evolved sensation, him and I. Diário da Inglaterra was written following the rhythm of the calendar, as it should be expected. It contains some personal notes on his existential uneasiness and everyday life. These are flash moments and fragments without any narrative, which have an element of the unexpected, even though they comprise recurrences and repetitions of everyday life at a village college. As far as we know, it was not rewritten or revised or reinterpreted for publication. Unlike Tempo Morto e Outros Tempos, Dead Time and Other Times by Gilberto Freire, for example, who also studied in England at Oxford University, soon after his studies in Texas and at Columbia University from 1918 to 1922, some years before Mário Peixoto. This is also different to the memorialistic texts written by the modernist artists in their old age, and that are part of a long tradition, even when they try to reinvent the format, as in the case for Gertrude Stein and in Brazil, Murilo Mendes. For Roland Barthes, in Deliberation, the initial ease of the diary is soon substituted by the artifice of sincerity, the artistic mediocrity of the spontaneous, or even worse, as he claims, an absence of effort that makes the diary an easy genre. However, it's this precariousness, absence of planning, and the pretension to create great work associated even with some diaries that have been reinterpreted or revised for publication that interests me in this smaller and more modest work, which comes overly close to individuality compared with the hegemony of the impersonal among the vanguards. Here we find a frail ego, unconvinced of its future importance or of the position that you would eventually strive to reach, which is exposed through this staging of the self. But it does not implode or explode into an orgy of masks, diving into the subconscious, dreams, or multiple alterities. No effort is made to create detailed descriptions of the foreign education of an upper-class young man in the first decades of the century, nor of the routine operations of an English college beyond certain feelings of unease while involved in disciplinary situations. Mário Peixoto rarely even mentions what he studies. It seems that he was studying basically English, but anyway. If there is any meaning in recovering this diary as a part of a queer historiography, this seems to come more from sensations and emotions than from a mere outing, as part of an anxious search for a mirror in the past in which we can see ourselves. Therefore, how should we view those that come before us in all of our differences and, of course, our similarities? There is no explicit ambition or mission to write, no great revelations, but the gradual experience that Mário has every day transforms him, imperceptibly but decisively, without him even notice. Is there a useless personal gesture, a delicate sensibility seeking company in this writing, even if this may be from himself? Cadernos Verdes, his posterior diary, includes incorporated excerpts from the fictional project that spanned his entire lifetime, but O Inútil de Cada, that's the name of this project, contains no clear trace of material from Diário da Inglaterra being used at this later time. At the end of 2017, if I'm not mistaken, during my second visit to the Mário Peixoto archive in Rio de Janeiro, I unexpectedly gained access to the writer's unedited diaries, these ones that I've mentioned. The theme of this talk is his diary, written in English, starting on January 1st, 1927, and stretching over 8 months. when he was between 18 and 19 years old. The diary starts when he had already arrived. I do not know, therefore, anything about his journey there. It ends on his last day, and so I also have no information on his return journey. What it contains is not just interesting for a veracity, but for the data it provides on sensibility, the way the young Mário felt and thought. Perhaps he maintained these formative elements, but it is also important to be attentive to the discontinuities and avoid any reductive biographies of this work, attempting to weave subtle threads between art and life to perceive how art can create both ways to be in company and ways to be lonely. Mário Peixoto seems to lend special importance to the writing of this diary, as he explains on the first day of May. And then, before quoting, I should say that Mário Peixoto was learning English when he wrote this diary. So, in the text that I quote, it will be kept originally as he wrote, without any alterations to syntax or vocabulary. He even mixed sometimes Portuguese and in English. So I don't know how much it's comprehensible for you. Hopefully you can comprehend, you can understand most of it. If not, I can go back at the end if you wish. So quoting Mário Peixoto, I have only 3 more months to write down in my diary, for after this, perhaps I will have no more opportunity. Who knows what's going to be of you, Mário? End of quote. This referral to himself in the third person is the trick he uses to stage his life throughout the diary. In Diário da Inglaterra, it's more appropriate to discuss a field of sensations than an intellectual field, to which he did not have any connection in England. It was a little different when he went to Paris the year after that travel. Neither are there any accounts of creative activities. There is a reference to him writing novels and a play that appears to have been staged, but even if it is indeed existed and were concluded works, I have not been able to gain access to them. There is also reference to trips to the cinema and to 1 or 2 books, but generally speaking, artistic texts take up little space in the diary. Knowing that his stay of less than a year was only temporary, his transitoriness seems to create a continuous sensation of loss that permeates the entire diary. He says goodbye every month to his friends. This sensation seems to manifest when there is a solar eclipse on June 29 in 1927. He is unable to witness this phenomenon due to the cloudy and rainy weather, and only notice a slight change in the light. He laments that this will only happen again in 1999, and that he may not be around to see it, which indeed turned out to be the case, as he died in 1992 at the age of 84. He also said, quote, I confess that I feel a certain anguish when thinking at my window, that many eyes who are seen today would be long ago dead for the next eclipse, end of quote. The passing of time is a strong experience for this teenage boy, during what seems to be the first time he journeyed apart from his family. It's as though this didn't just translate into a desire to return home, but that on the inside he carried an old man, an inheritance from another world that would materialize with his later achievements, that I refer to as an anachronistic survival of a decadent environment and a dandy sensibility. A return to modernism does not mean having to go back to the canonic values of modernity, nor does it imply a search among all that was repressed, marginalized, or silenced. So what is the purpose of this plunge into the sensations? As well as Mário Peixoto, I also have a particular interest in the writers Otávio de Faria and Lúcio Cardoso, as well as the hypothetical possibility of a group mostly made up of Catholic, cosmopolitan, conservative, and political absentees. These were known as the chroniclers of the murder house, to use the term of the sociologist Sergio Miceli, not just due to their class connections, but also as a result of their shared perception of the world. Some were queer, but they were all interested in narratives of intimacy. Through the closeness of sensibility, I believe that names such as Cornélio Pena, Osvaldo Gueldi, Ismael Neri, and Murilo Mendes can be associated with this, to mention just a few Brazilian artists of the time who had an interest in this area of research. They were much different to that, with an interest in forming national culture through the work of Mário de Andrade, to the anthropophagic lineage reclaimed by tropicalism, and to their regionalist versions, which are mostly the successors of a documental tradition of social realism. All of these represent the most hegemonic threads in this history of Brazilian modernism. So in a certain way, I'm more interested for those who lose the battle of modernism in Brazil, including Mário Peixoto. At this talk, I focus on the period before Mário Peixoto became involved with Rio de Janeiro's intellectual and artistic scene at the end of 1920s and 1930s. I will concentrate for now on Mário Peixoto, the grandson of Joaquim José de Souza Breves, the Second Empire's biggest coffee producer, the most active slave trader of this time, and the owner, I think it's unimaginable, it's difficult to imagine for me, the owner of 20 farms located in the south of Rio de Janeiro state. At the age of 18, Mário Peixoto left to study at Hope College, as I told you. And so this was an all-boys college, as was normal in the day, which appears to no longer exist as until today. I have been unable to access any archive on this institution and its students. Nobody could have predicted what would have happened to him a few years later, although this is not what I was looking for. He had the potential, much like other younger people, for exactly that which is barely suggested in the diary. It would be unfair to want to find the director of Limite from 1931 in it retrospectively. We don't have time to show the movie clip, but maybe if you have interest, we can show the movie, a movie clip after the talk, but it's also available at YouTube if you are interested at this movie. It's the only movie that he did. So the first screening of Limite was held at the Chaplin Film Society. It was the only film he managed to finish. He tried to do other movies. At one point, almost lost to time. It has since been restored and found renewed interest from 1970s to nowadays, named in 2015 by the Brazilian Film Critics Association Best Brazilian Film of All Time. In the same year, in 1931, Mário Peixoto published his only book of poems called Mundéu. Another poem book would be published after his death. And in 1935, O Inútil de Cada, the Uselessness of Everyone, the first version and first volume of the Urban Flav project that would occupy him time until the end of his life. It is still mostly unedited, but almost all of its 2,000 pages have been digitalized into the Mário Peixoto archive. I want to show now one photo that for me was very important. So I don't know if you see the guys who are standing, he is the second from the left to the right. No, I don't know if I can see. Is the view okay for you? Are you seeing the photos?
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine. Okay. So when Mário Peixoto arrived in England, he was given a camera by his grandmother. Before starting work on his diary, I examined this photo that we're seeing of Mário Peixoto at Hope. A gesture can only be recovered through another, and by another body that, upon being touched or looked upon, reverberates with the tremor and the splendor of long ago. For a long time, this was the only photo that I had of his stay at Hopeden. Rounded shoulders, slanted gaze, and squinting. This is a well-known photo that can easily be found on the internet, in which he is standing second from the left among his classmates and possibly his teachers. It's easy to identify his two Japanese friends, Ide and Nietzsche. I don't know if you, so here, the last one who is standing, and also here, the first row. And were a constant presence in his daily life. He not only took and sent photos to his grandmother, but also allowed himself to be photographed, as he registered on February 22nd at the Ladislau studio, fascinated by the world of the famous. I need to skip some quotations for the diary, but I think the main idea I'll try to summarize for not taking too much time. So he affirms the importance. He affirms the importance of the imagination through one of his characters in O Inútil de Cada. So this fantasy that he had to become a film star also appears from a different perspective. And now I'm quoting the novel. Reality for me has no consistency. What can be done? I know it's and such, but have absolutely no part in it. It's as though it didn't exist. There is no doubt that I can see it, but that's all. And if I refer to it, but it does not penetrate me, and in a tone of thought in which we refer to things that are not evident or don't get in the way, as they have no effect. End of quotation. More than a mixture, this undecidability between reality and fantasy would be an important theme throughout his life, not in the form of pathological lying, but as a desire to live the happiness of the impossible, to quote the phrase by Ludwig II in the film of the same name by Luchino Visconti, or simply out of faith in power of fiction, the fictionalization even of his own existence according to accounts by those who knew him, including Saulo Pereira de Mello, responsible for the Mário Peixoto archive. This was also noticeable in the awareness of the photo as a production of his image, as in 1,000 Words, Portrait, Style and Queer Modernism by Jamie Hovey, a book on the modern intellectuals and their relationship with photography. His desire to be an actor could indicate the desire to become the other and exhibit himself as it appears when he refers to himself once more in the third person, quoting, "Am I not a sportsman? Perhaps that's what you are trying to be, Mario." End of quote. In addition, if, as according to Hovey, photos represented privileged spaces of queer expression for the modernists, it's symptomatic that it was exactly the photos that he took that seem to have been a cause of displeasure for his family. In one of these, and I'll put the other one, it's the final one. So in one of these, he was holding hands with one of his schoolmates, or did they have arms linked as they do in the following photograph? This gesture of affection between men, demonstrating their happiness and pleasure at spending time together, whatever this meant at the time, seems not to have been well received by his family. Cadernos Verdes includes letters from one of his cousins, though we do not know how much of this he invented or rewrote while working on this text for publication. In Diário da Inglaterra, on May 26, Mário Peixoto says, "I received awful letters from Cornelia and Olga. My photos have been a very scandal to my family. I'm nearly mad and very unhappy. I can't realize why they took the matter so seriously. I do hope Cornelia, will do something for me. I can't write anymore and I'm seeking with desgosto," something like desgosto in Portuguese and disgust. So this family conflict seems to persist 2 months later, as on July 25 he writes, quote, "I think that must have been something wrong with Dad because there is 2 months since I received the last letter from home. I don't wonder if later on I shall discover that all this is caused by my photos." End of quote. So it's clear that the family's uneasy was connected to Mario's frail masculinity and also race issues. This was during the time after the trial of Oscar Wilde, when effeminacy, according to Alan Sinfield at the Wilde Century, was increasingly seen as a sign of homosexuality and very different to the aristocratic type of masculinity. Pose, where there is no confession or proof, is a way of constructing a self-performing subjectivity containing echoes of dandyism. Therefore, unlike the conventional and impersonal interpretation of modernism, this seems to be a more subtle way of bringing together art and life. In order to understand his relationship with his body, we can talk about shame, the controversial emotion that has been explored in queer studies in recent years, in opposition to pride. Mário Peixoto demonstrates shame for not belonging, not being a part of where he was, and for his shyness, this being typical of gay teenagers before Stonewall, as Eve Sedgwick remembers us at Touching Feeling. The diary gave him the freedom to write down what he probably didn't dare say in public. Shame at not being able to see people arguing or not wanting to bother his friends who had visitors. Shame even at his own body, as we can observe on May 26, when he refers to a comment by Miss Goldsmith's Nietzsche's girlfriend. And I think I need to quote to make this quotation, because I think it's important to understand the importance of the diary. So, quoting, "I'm now very upset because Miss Goldsmith gave me advice not to be so effeminate. I really think that's right because sometimes I do really be girlish. How, as I am discussing with my own mind, I can say that of girlish I only own exterior. My interior, only I know how male it is. But this sort of thing is worrying me quite a lot. It's not any fault to be too much kind and delicate because this is the fruit of being almost educated between girls. But from today, I settle in mind to correct myself. And it's a word that's I wasn't able to understand it. And in spite or in spent, I thank Miss Goldsmith very much. I'm very glad because my friend would not find a wife with better qualities." End of quotation. So this shame at his effeminate nature can be understood as the panic associated with homosexuality from the second half of the 19th century. Was this also what led to my difficulty in assessing the photos making up his personal story, which was not the case for his film, novel, and the poems? The fact that Mário Peixoto used male, M-A-L-Y, instead of male, M-A-L-E, apart from any error in his spelling, may indicate a lesson and a strange masculinity that he did not correct while increasingly distancing himself from his family. The mixture of shame, shyness, and courage in these photos is also revealed in the writing style he used in Cadernos Verdes, his later diary, as well as the images and text that he wrote at the time, and perhaps even in the text of his life, which is not always writable, and if it's written, that's not usually in the form of a confection. In any case, these few photos show a vitality in moments of happiness and encounters that nothing other than time itself can take away from them. Joy and the ecstasy of presence live on through them. Setting the photos to one side, I return to my original question. Why read this diary if not as a means to studying the artist as a young man? Why study him in this way if he was not yet an artist at the time? As he says on March 25, 1927, on his 19th birthday, quoting, "Really, till now I have not done anything which really I want. I would like to be an actor. Is all I want in this world, and for this I have not yet done anything." End of quote. Later on in this diary, why don't we let ourselves ponder on the uncertainties and doubts he laid out in his brief annotations written in a language he did not master? Perhaps this actually enabled him to express what he was still unable to say in Portuguese. Diaries in England contains a linguistic and emotional precariousness. Language and emotion come across as foreign, as it is for this reason. I have maintained the text exactly as it was written to the extent possible, making alterations only where necessary to facilitate understanding. He makes sense of his anxieties by using words in the simplest of the structures, in the same way that Jonas Mekas does in Lost, Lost, Lost. Language can always be learned, but how can one put a name to the enchantment of a new acquaintance? Which emotions seize and go through him in this foreign country, so far from his family? What makes him so happy when he is with Nishi and Ide, his closest friends, throughout his stay? The diary could be just seen as foreign as England, but perhaps he used as it a way to talk about himself with more courage. In the diary, he finds a place of his own. The diary held meaning for him as it represented the possibility of confronting his reservations, despite his wavering use of the language and his reluctance to change or correct it. I'm going to skip some quotations. Many of his Sundays were marked by emptiness and solitude, much like those of anyone who finds themselves far from their families and other emotional networks, or who has no idea what to do with their time when they are not working or studying, having to invent their days according to how they want to live and survive. He would go on to endure this learning experience both in and through solitude for a long time. But would he have the character to confront his boredom? The memory of this sensation he felt on Sundays and holidays is both physical and material, not just abstract and intellectual. Quoting, when I remember the first day of our last holidays, I feel a very strange sensation. I want only to go on, but never to come back, not even to remember those ancient times here in Hopeden. Please me. I mean, when I began to revive the time I arrived here, a cold shudder walks over all my body. End of quote. End of quote. He missed the family farm, the monarchist city of Petropolis, and his grandmother. He even likens the reign in England to that of Petropolis. What does fantasy begin and reality end? He sees the period he's going through as follows, quote, as I said before, I like to see the time run quickly. I am in a dream, and I hope to awake only in June, end of quote. I ask myself once more what I can learn from these writings. In the absence of any other facts or witness accounts, how can a story be staged using so little? How can this solitude be felt if not through my own? And how can the sensations he experienced, such as fondness for a dark, rainy days when he was able to go to cinema, be recaptured? Let us follow these annotations like the days of a world that ceased to exist long ago, following the First World War that had torn Europe apart, and 2 years before the crash of 1929 that ruined various fortunes, led many to suicide, and condemned millions to unemployment and poverty. According to his diary, neither the events of the recent past nor the future of nations seemed to affect Mário Peixoto. Perhaps he did not find these things important enough to discuss in his diary. Perhaps they simply did not matter to him at the time, while he was losing and finding himself in the isolated world of an English school. He speaks more about what he does in his spare time than his daily routine at the school, except when he experienced some kind of grief, he lives a regimented life interspersed with the odd trip out. Returning to the photo with his school friends, he's posing and clearly affected. No, this one. He's thin and frail, with one shoulder leaning below the other and a tilted head. What more does he have to tell us? The diary's inscription provides a clue. Every day gone has to me the value of a pill took out from a necklace. This depicts the transitory nature of time, as well as the anachronistic decadent crepuscularism of the 1920s. The day is given a dimension of beauty and artifice through a feminine object, the necklace. After the necklace, he kisses a photo of his mother who died in 1922. The year and the diary begin with this image, as well as various mentions of his grandmother and his cousins, through whom he had already established a certain affection for the feminine. In England, he is far from his feminine line of support and affection. He becomes an adult when he ceases to be a son, and he tries to hide his experience of distance and solitude in his letters to his grandmother and his cousins. He sends attempts at fiction to his father, the response to which I do not know, but his censorship, acquisition and burning of the first edition of O Inútil de Cada in 1935 should be remembered. Few feminine figures appear in England. On the other hand, his male friendships take up considerable space in his diaries in England, especially those with Ide and Nietzsche that I mentioned, his two best friends, during his stay at Hopeden. I do not know much about them, but they could have been the sons of a doctor working for the Japanese imperial court. They went on trips together and to cinema in London, during which Mário slept over at Ide's house. He played golf, tennis, and went out on bike rides with him, despite them being forbidden to do so. Could this have been prohibited to prevent the boys from going out together? Was this one of the mechanisms of control used to avoid emotional involvements in an exclusively all-boys school? They also danced the Brazilian machixe, and Nietzsche even reads his diary, which doesn't seem to bother him at all. Unlike in the books mentioned, relationships were maintained within a limited field of masculine homosociability, accepted by the institution, which appeared to tolerate these small escapades. According to the diary, however, the use of certain words and attitudes betray an adolescent enchantment in Mário that surpassed camaraderie and uneroticized friendship. In the same way that masculinity seems to be erased here, love also appears through the similarity of this word in Portuguese. Quote, I've never had friends in my life, but I think that now I found two. Nietzsche and Ide are lovely boys. I think that the only thing I'm going to live in Hopeden that really I care much are those two friends. End of quote. His great dependency on these two friends make him feel like a dog without his master, quoting him. So friendship mixed with fascination suggests affection or a desire that must not be mentioned, particularly in the case of Nietzsche, who has a girlfriend. Does it make it even harder for this affection to be expressed or corresponded? In the diary, love, with the exception of the adverb lovely, is only evoked in a poem on the inside cover, and I quote the poem. I love love, through though he has wings, and like light can flee, but above all other things, spirit, I love thee. Does he really just love to love, or is he avoiding naming the person he loves? Is there anyone behind this spirit that he claims to love? When it comes to their final goodbye, once again, photos have a role in attempting to maintain his friendship and ties. Quoting. So at last, one of the cruel days of separation arrived. Miss Goldness is going away tomorrow, and so is Nietzsche. As a remembrance, I gave to each both a thought of mine. But what is in comparison of the great friendship that I have for them. Mário Peixoto concerns with his image can be more easily understood with his loves. I'm quoting certain parts, so maybe hopefully you can understand. So his fascination for his image that I mentioned before, related to his idea of his desire to become an actor and a star. So is also connected with his love for clothes and shoes. This love of clothes goes on as demonstrated by the collection of shoes he left behind when he died. This is yet another sign of his links to dandyism. This attitude was violently criticized by Otávio de Faria, a childhood friend, in a letter dated July 26 in 1929, who pressured him to fit a description of masculinity that was more in line with the standards of the time. And I think it's important to quote this letter. So it's Otávio de Faria who is writing. Should I speak of it? Should I not? It bothers me very little. I will go ahead without standing on ceremony. But what do you want? I cannot swallow your dandy's clothes and your shoes with those leather coves over the laces. I don't even want to say it. Look, Mario, let's leave this to those who don't have anything and need to have something to worry about. You still have to realize that in Brazil, just like in Europe, a real man in stress doesn't care about clothes. I'm not saying you are badly dressed or dirty, but you can get regular clothes that don't attract attention, and plainer shoes that are also made from fine leather. For those for whom nature was not so kind, such as the two of us, if you excuse my frankness and the company, this is indispensable. It's a form of defense that makes life less bitter. One day we will agree with me. End of quote. The fact that his career as an actor or romantic lead never took off was also a subject for discussion, but his mythic image in Brazilian culture, albeit not just this, did develop. The diary is a story made up of glimpses of desired bodies, received or interrupted touches and gestures. These touches and gestures always contain something that escapes representation, even when this is immobilized in paintings, sculpture, photos, or memory. In any case, the few friends he had represented a contrast to his general dislike of his time at Hopeden and his daily routine there, which comes up at various points in the diary, and the sensation that he was wasting his time. In addition to his irritation with Hopeden, he feels generally unease among the English. He had another friend that was Greek. That's one of the few names that he mentioned. So what remains, and I'm finishing, once this period has passed, is a sensitive, daring, shy, and delicate boy who is dependent on his friends and always careful not to offend. His courage appears more in his writing than in everyday life, or maybe it was the diary that enabled his small movements of bravery, as he writes on May 7, quote, everything that came to mind. Despite his friends, he feels trapped inside a cage, like a Tennessee Williams character. Or does this just show a certain tendency towards being overly dramatic? Mário Peixoto's diary ends on a frontier. With this upcoming journey home, goes back to writing in Portuguese and has no idea what he'll do next. On August 5, he writes, it's almost the end, it's really the end of the diary. I went to London and bought the ticket for the Alcantara. It starts on the 24th of this month. It's a lovely ship, but I'm somehow dizzy. Mr. Ellis was very kind and took Edu and I to lunch at the Trocadero. What a lovely place. Afterwards, we went to the Brazilian consulate, and the Portuguese language sounded to me very strangely. We walked all over London, and now here I am in bed thinking and thinking very hard, for I have such a lot to do that I don't know from where to begin. End of quote. If silence, exile, and irony are the answers that James Joyce's young artist obtains with the arrival of adult life, Mário Peixoto is left with other responses, such as theatricality, uselessness, and sensation. He's left with the sea that he crossed on his return to Brazil, an ocean that will yet conjure other images. The sensation in his diary of something lost forever achieves its greatest strength in the immensity of the sea before the insignificance and frailty of the life portrayed by his characters in Limite. The glistening ocean in which his characters are shipwrecked and disappear has a beauty that redeems the precariousness of their insignificant lives. There is no mention of the sea in his diary, but on returning to Mangaratiba, to Brazil, he rediscovers on land, much of which belongs to his family, that this speaks to him of the ruins of a rich past in the 19th century. In the region of Mangaratiba, he finds not his place of origin, but a future and a strange belonging. This is where he would go on to shoot Limite and went on to spend even more time there. Far from a sensation of nation or region, the sea conveys to him a strange feeling of sensorial and sensual belonging, where the individual might only be able to disappear into his unpublished writing. Regarding castaways, as Mário Peixoto said while being interviewed by Marcos Tandin in Luiz Henrique Romagnoli, quoting, "We are all castaways, there is no escape." But, as in Limite, that shipwreck provides a shelter, a dispersion across the water to a world that's very different from the land and the beings that roam and live on it. This is not a contemplation, but an immersion to be absorbed, shattered into reflections of light, as fleeting as the froth that washes against the sands. The sea brings him another body. Abandoning something is to save it from existence. Apparently, this is the opposite gesture of gathering vestiges, is the task of the historian. Here, on the other hand, living things, people, and facts to be forgotten is a form of salvation. After everything that has been said, all that's left is the greatest liberty provided by invisibility, extinction, and nothingness. Leave time to go about its slow and immovable task. Don't try to retain a thing or remember anything. Each moment becomes increasingly faceless, voiceless, and without a presence. When memories are affirmed and praised at any cost as a force of resistance, there is the liberating gesture of forgetting. When appearing and appearance are celebrated in the media, perhaps the greatest freedom lies in disappearing. Mário Peixoto incarnates the dilemma that João Cornélio Rodrigues Peixoto, his own father, indicate, uniting them through words in a way that the life that separated them was unable to. And I end with these words from his father. He said, "There are two types of men of letters, those who write novels, poems, and those who lived before writing them. The former bequeath us, when they die, just the fictitious world of figures and feelings that their imaginations created. The latter leaves us more than that, the reality of their personal drama, the agitated world of beings that gravitate around their existence. Some leave us just literature, others leave us life itself." That's it.
Thank you very much, Denilson. That was great. I think could we take the PowerPoints out? And I'm wondering whether we could run the film while we're discussing, just to kind of, I think it would be quite useful to see the film that you referred so much, because it's kind of quite a contrast in the reflections on his diary as a kind of very young man, and the kind of experimental nature of the film, which he did, what, 5 years later? I can't remember. No, 10 10 years later, no?
No, he traveled in 1926, 27.
Okay.
So
Yeah, so 4 or 5, yeah,
yes, yes.
4 years later. And it's quite incredible that the kind of leap from a kind of what seems from the diary discussion quite an insecure kind of young man to quite an accomplished kind of experimental film. And while Elise is setting that up, I'd like to just kind of go back to certain points that you made, just to kind of clarifying initially. You mentioned that he arose or emerged from quite a decadent context. Were you referring to his family or the?
Just, Michael, are you watching the movie or not?
Yes, I am.
Sorry. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes, but it's silent. But there is a music that's very important to maybe. I don't know if you mind to listen to the music too. I don't know. Yes, I can hear. I don't know if you can.
Maybe we can run this for a minute or so, and, until the scene of the boat.
Yes, this is the beginning of the movie, not the first moments after the introduction. I mean.
The soundtrack is original, or was it kind of later?
No, it's Debussy, Gymnopédie. No, it was used by different European composers. There is also a Brazilian musician who helped him, but most of them were music that, well, at the time it wasn't so known. No, Debussy, Stravinsky.
What I mean is that he kind of included that soundtrack himself. It wasn't something that
Yes.
Yeah.
The sound is a little low, but yes, it's better than this, believe me.
It's never good with the kind of Zoom or equivalents.
So this is the boat. The idea of shipwreck is connected with the image that the three main characters are there. And after this, we are going to have the story of each one of these characters, and this man and two women. Maybe you can stop here. I don't know. That's yes.
So there is you mentioned not kind of necessarily believing some of his statements, etc. And there is this kind of history of him inventing things, and I kind of read somewhere, I can't remember where, that he invented this claim that Eisenstein kind of considered his film as the best kind of, I can't remember the quote, but he invented a whole kind of mythology around it, which people believe.
More than this, he wrote a text that was supposed being done by Eisenstein, but he wrote it. And nowadays we have this small book of his 4 articles. He didn't write much, and then it is include this piece that it's really a great art. Perhaps one of the best articles that we have about himself was done by him as Eisenstein.
Which kind of suggests a pretty kind of audacious kind of character, very different from the kind of the shy, insecure person that the diary kind of projects. No?
Well, in fact, this theatricality is present since the beginning. For instance, he used to write letters for his cousins. So this idea of being someone else appears since the beginning. Besides the shyness, but I consider more this experience of theatricality, or being someone else, or his fantasy of becoming an actor. In fact, he appears at the movie. For those who see the movie, he has a small role at the end. That's very important also. It's only the moments that are intertitles, that is really a dialogue. He played a role at a play before the movie. So in fact, he didn't want to direct this movie. He wanted to be an actor in this movie.
But I mean, I was seeing lots of parallels, like contemporary parallels, when you were talking. I had no kind of previous knowledge of this diary, and I only knew Mário Peixoto's film very kind of periphery. I hadn't actually seen it until you mentioned you were going to talk about it. But lots of contemporaneous kind of parallels. So you mentioned Oscar Wilde's trial and the whole kind of idea of shame, etc. But in the kind of 10s and 20s in the UK, there was the Bloomsbury group, which kind of had kind of I mean, a strong what today would be seen a kind of a LGBT kind of connections or relations, which seemed to be kind of contemporary to when he was in the UK. Now, of course, he was in a very kind of outsider context in Eastbourne. Did you say? Was it Eastbourne? Yeah. So kind of completely disconnected from that kind of avant-garde milieu. So I'm kind of wondering what kind of milieu did he come from in Brazil? You mentioned a kind of a decadence. Was that in relation to his family? Was that in relation to the to what exactly? Could you expand?
Mainly because of his family, no? So I mentioned his great-grandfather, that was the most important coffee farmer, in Brazil. So and on the other side of the family, on the side of his father, and the family had sugar cane plantations too. So it was it's really something that come from the 19th century family, this elite who were monarchists, and in a certain way, the end of slavery start to put all this world in crisis. No?
So they didn't kind of because between the 19th century and the 20th century, there's a kind of tradition in the economy of the country, from sugarcane to coffee. Coffee became, I mean, the time he was in England, coffee, people working with coffee, owning coffee plantations, were hugely rich in the mid-20s. The example, I mean, coffee, as Mário da Silva Brito says, the Brazilian modernism arises from the meeting of the coffee fields with the Eiffel Tower. So the coffee enabled these artists and intellectuals to spend time in Paris and living kind of cosmopolitan lives with the avant-garde, etc., which was very different from the case you've just illustrated.
It happened in São Paulo, with the modernists in São Paulo.
Yeah.
It was also this kind of combination between the money from the coffee and the money with the industry. This kind of a combination of this old money, if you can say like this, that was coming from plantation, from coffee, and the industry. It didn't happen in Rio de Janeiro. In Rio de Janeiro, the end of this crisis that happened at the second half of 19th century wasn't possible to reconnect with new money. So some of them start to sell their land. Some of them have become, I mean, doctors or lawyers or journalists. Sometimes they have lands and I mean, houses in Rio de Janeiro, but they weren't able to improve the money. Or it was the case of Mário Peixoto. Mário Peixoto never worked. During his whole life, what he did was to spend and to sell things. No, it was so. His experience is very interesting because most of the things that he did in 5 years, from 1931 to 1935, but nothing commercial. No? So one book of poems, one movie that almost nobody saw at the time. One novel that also that the father didn't like, so he tried to fire the books that were available. So, and after that he tried to make other screenplays, and he wrote, but he never published. And so it was it's a very unprofessional life. He was a kind of an amateur. For instance, dandy. It's interesting to understand him. So I think there is a connection with decadence because of his family and also because of his sensibility. So it's a little anachronistic talking about decadentism in 1920s with all the avant-garde movement, but I think it's comprehensible for this, not only his case, but other artists that come from this. I use this expression from Sergio Michel, the chronicles of the murder house, who came from this rich family, or that weren't so rich anymore, from the 19th century.
I couldn't avoid drawing connections with Mário de Andrade and how he was mocked by Oswald de Andrade for his sexuality, and that is kind of a contemporaneous, and I can't remember when the two kind of who were friends until a certain point. I think it was towards the end of the 20s when they kind of broke up because of this kind of critique of Mário de Andrade's kind of, I don't know how I can't remember how he put it, but yeah, it's a suggestion of his homosexuality, and they never spoke again, I think. So the kind of at the same time, while there was a kind of...
Yes, there is an issue. A colleague of us, César Braga Pinto, just published an important article on Mário de Andrade in this issue of his homosexuality. That's something that normally, I mean, scholars in São Paulo don't mention so much, or don't consider important. But I want to go back to one thing that you said before about the Bloomsbury group. Even they were open, but they were open until a certain point. But they are opening inside the group. For instance,
we just don't talk about it kind of way. Yeah.
Yes. Foster published Morris only after, I think it was after his death, or very close to his death, in 1970s. So the issues, I mean, people knew they have an important group, an important circle, but it's not so visible, even in England. I think it's important.
There is a kind of aristocratic kind of laissez-faire kind of attitudes, but it is it's a social class kind of libertarianism, I guess.
I think so too.
Something that wouldn't be allowed, or it wouldn't be so accommodating within people from other lower classes, I guess. Mm-hmm. But you also mentioned when you mentioned decadence, I kind of started making connections with another comment. I think you associate Guilty and I can't remember the other names, but as a kind of a melancholic group. I think that's the term you used. And I was kind of, because Gildi's work is the one I know better, I kind of wondered if there was a certain kind of connection with a kind of expressionistic sensibility, which isn't, I mean, there is a kind of a very strong, I wouldn't say strong, but there is a tradition of expressionism in Brazil, which isn't very well kind of discussed. Instead, it's more the kind of Tarsila do Amaral and the kind of post-Cubist kind of, but there is a very strong, and Gildi is one of the kind of principal exponents, but also the woodcut, the xilografia medium. I'm wondering if there is any connection in that sense with Peixoto.
Yes, in fact, I'm giving a seminar at our course now that is inspired by a work by Paulo Venâncio, his MA dissertation, that he tries to understand. It was something written a long time ago, but he tried to put in dialogue Gildi, Mário Peixoto, and Cornélio Pena. That perhaps, I don't know if you are familiar, that's is a writer, but also he was a very an interesting visual artist, not so much, more an illustrator than a painter. And at this moment, Paulo Venâncio was more interested in a more philosophical debate about crisis of subjectivity. He didn't mention anything related to expressionism, but for sure, in case of Gildi, there is at least one book that was written about this kind of dark modernity in Gildi. But Gildi was he was a son of a foreigner, he didn't belong so much to groups. He was a little isolated too. So I think there is a certain cartography that one needs to do that's not connected with anthropophagy to tropicalism. I mean, this whole important and great tradition that's very visible abroad. And we can talk about Tarsila, we can talk about from Tarsila to Eliot Sica. So these are those who won the cultural battle of avant-garde. But there are other avant-gardes that I think they are interesting too. Not to say that one is better than the others. It's just different expressions that I think you are right, that one thing that you can connect is expressionist. And another thing that was also important, not only for this group, that is a connection with Baroque. We know that Mário de Andrade and other moderns were very interested in this discovery of Minas Gerais and the cities connect to Baroque. But I think at the level of sensibility, it was also very important for a group of writers and painters, this fascination for ruins related to sometimes that we call dead cities, that these small cities that had these huge plantations, and after that they become decadent places, or for suburbs, because in case of Gildi, he was much more interested with the experience of the multitude, but the experience of the suburbs, so the people who are alone in the city. So I think that there is a cartography that one needs to be done, I think, and important artists that need to be reevaluated and confronted with these other traditions in Brazil.
Yeah, with Eliot Sica is an interesting example, because I still remember how his homosexuality was denied even by the family until recently. They would argue that that's kind of not the point, etc. But it's obvious that, especially in several key points in his trajectory, his discovery of the favela community in Mangueira, for example, is very much linked to sexuality and kind of sexual encounters, and later on in New York. And it's speaking about this kind of mainstream art history. It's interesting how his work has been kind of formalized in this kind of from the plane of the picture to space, etc., and completely divorced from any biographical and kind of sexual kind of trajectory that he had and also was kind of key in the development of his work.
For Mário Peixoto too, he went to this part of the south seaside of the state of Rio de Janeiro because of the landscape, because of at least is my hypothesis, but also because of the fishermen, because of there's a whole connection between this connection between different social classes that was much easier for him to establish the contact with these people than people with the same class. No, so it's also this kind of strange history between sexual and class encounters that has happened.
Which also is evident in his friends, Ibe and Niche. Is that their names?
Ide and Niche, yes.
The fact that they were foreigners themselves seems to me revealing of a particular kind of welcoming of the British, of the English in particular, the welcoming nature of the English. The whole talk kind of had kind of quite brought back some personal memories of when I came to England as a teenager to spend a year. And it was the most isolated year of my life. I just felt completely completely out of fish out of water, so to speak, incapable of making any connections with any of the other kids. Also in a all boys school, which by the way is still something common in this country, single sex schools. So yeah, although it was in the 20s, there's certain things that remain the same. I'm not sure if there are any questions, but because I did say that feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, but no one has expressed themselves. But
I have one, Michael. If
okay.
That's,
okay.
Yeah. I have been listening. So yeah. So I guess Denilson, I was quite interested. Sorry, you can hear I'm on a train actually.
Oh.
Coming back from an appointment. I was quite interested whether you could say a bit more about the dynamics of race and how that intersected with gender, sexuality, and masculinity in the way that you described it very articulately in the talk. And was there a racial dynamic to this and at that time, and also what were the implications of that racial dynamic for thinking through histories of modernism, if that makes sense?
Well, as far as I know, I mean, what was, I don't know if it's, I don't know if everybody knows, the most important Japanese migration wave was to Brazil, no? And although they suffer a lot of prejudice when they moved, no, so it was after the slavery, so it was expected more that the Europeans should go, people from Italy, from Germany, from East Europe. So there was this, the reception of Japanese was very, I don't know, complicated, and so. The fact that Mário Peixoto and his closest friends were Japanese, and after that there is this Greek guy that is mentioned, but in fact his friends were these two. I think it was the impact in his family was because of the kind of relation that he may have, that he expressed. I mean, the kind of affectivity that wasn't so visible, at least for a very traditional conservative family that was Mário Peixoto's family. He didn't belong to a family of intellectual, but a very traditional Catholic family. And also because they were Japanese. He wasn't making friends with at least European. No, so I think this is another point that's very interesting to establish. It was a point that was made for me when I presented this research 2 years ago, and I didn't develop this point, but I think it is important for this moment. The way that there is a kind of alliance between this Brazilian gay guy and this Japanese that weren't gay, but they seem to
not mind.
Yes, to have things in common. I don't know, the same rejection from the others. Maybe I'm not sure. But I tried to discover who are they, but I wasn't able to know more, and they didn't meet after that time. So they didn't. So it was only this 1 year that he was at Hope, and so he missed contact after that. Because after that, in the year 1 year after, Mário Peixoto goes to Paris, and it was in Paris that he started to think about Limite, and well, and then I think he was in a capital, not in a small village like in case of Hope, so he was much more open for him, all the intellectual possibilities. But I think the connection between these two young men and Nietzsche, it was lost. But something that's very interesting, for instance, nowadays there is an exhibition on modernism. I don't know if Michael knows. That's in one of the Sesc in São Paulo. That's about, I think it's Sesc 24 de agosto, if I'm not mistaken. That's an idea of reviewing modernism through popular culture. And one of the main ways of redefining modernism is connected with Japanese migration. Because as you know, there are lots of very important people from Japanese ascendants that were.
It's the largest diaspora, Japanese diaspora in the world.
Yes, and also very important for abstractionism in Brazil. And so it's something interesting to read this redefinition of modernism. I don't know if it was what you were asking, Paul, about, but I think there is also this possibility of redefining.
Yes, precisely.
Through popular culture, through people who are excluded from the São Paulo city, or at least from the elite of São Paulo. So I think that's it's one thing that's very important at this moment that we're celebrating 100 years of the Modern Art Week. Definitely, it's an important point.
I find it interesting that, especially right now under the government of Brazil, etc., that the celebrations is of 100 years of the Modern Art Week in São Paulo, and the Modern Art Week was a celebration of the centenary of the independence, but I hardly hear any kind of celebrations about the Brazilian independence, or given the current context, I guess. But the Japanese a sign of the Japanese presence in Brazil, which is a kind of a product of a kind of a government policy of attempting to whiten the kind of the Brazilian race, so to speak, by bringing in poor Europeans, mainly Italians, but also Japanese, in order to kind of dilute the kind of predominantly Black presence as a kind of result of slavery. I think that's an important issue to state in this kind of in the kind of mass migration that Brazil received from the 19th century, late 19th century, following the abolition. And also there was Anita Malfacci's exhibition in 1917 that featured a Japanese kind of painted in expressionist kind of style, green and colorful, that was very harshly reviewed by one of the kind of main writers at the time, Monteiro Lobato. So the Japanese presence was already kind of present in a way within the kind of pre-Modern Art Week events. I think we're coming.
Thank you both for answering that. I think I really got a great understanding. No, you really both went into depth, much more than I expected. So thank you so much.
There is on that question. There is also the given the proximity. There is also the curious fact that when the architect and painter Le Corbusier traveled to Brazil, to Rio for the first time, he traveled on a ship. His kind of metaphor for the machine for living, the house, the machine for living like a ship. He traveled by ship, accompanied by Josephine Baker, who was the kind of the muse of Parisian negrophilia in the 20s. And it's interesting that the father of purism and have traveled together and had a relationship. Actually, there's kind of some kind of quite revealing sketches that he made on the ship and maybe etc. So there is a kind of this idea of the purity of French classical culture as a kind of inheritant, the inheritor of the Western tradition, which kind of transpires in the manifest, the Purist Manifesto, which is from 1920, I think, I can't remember, or 19, somewhere like that. With the it's kind of exuberant kind of jazz dancer singer that was such a kind of huge hit in Paris. So that's kind of like the rational and the kind of so-called primitive, kind of one kind of confirming the other through the kind of extreme oppositions. It's interesting that they land in Rio in 1929, and that kind of, I see that as a kind of connected to Tarsilo do Amaral painting A Negra, which is a product of Parisian kind of fascination with Black culture in the 20s as well. This fascination with Black culture in the 20s translated into this kind of idealized imagery of a kind of a slave-owning families kind of farm, and the kind of abstract geometry of sophisticated Paris. There is a kind of connection somewhere there between 23 and 29.
Absolutely, Michael. And I was aware of the link between Le Corbusier and Josephine Baker. And of course, you know, Le Corbusier was obsessed with jazz. And in one of his sort of biographical texts, When the Cathedrals Were White, he talked about his trip to New York in the 1940s, where he wrote at length about the Negro and the role of the Negro in the machine culture and the culture of the machine, which he believed was driving modernism, and argued that the Negro labor, Negro bodies, and Negro improvisation through jazz was the embodiment of machine culture, right? But it's really interesting because if you read that account quite closely, there's a dynamic of attraction and repulsion, you know, because he sort of says how he has a great section where he talks about Louis Armstrong. He goes to Harlem, he goes to the Cotton Club, I think, or one of the jazz clubs in Harlem, and he sees Louis Armstrong play live. And it's a really great description where he sort of says he's absolutely mesmerized and horrified by the screaming trumpet of Louis Armstrong, you know, how on the one hand it represented a form of fluid mathematics, but at the same time it was like, you know, it also talked about the screams of the jungle and things like this. So it's a really interesting how Blackness and race was conceived by some of the architects of modernism, you know, and how it played this kind of dual role of horror, but also, you know, progressiveness and futurity. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I didn't know about that, but that's super interesting. It's also, sorry,
I don't know if you read Paul knows Rafael Cardoso's book that was published in English and also in Portuguese, Modernity in Black and White, if I'm not mistaken. It's very interesting.
No, I don't. I'll have to read that, Denilson.
Yes, it's very interesting, and he's closer to you. He's in Berlin. He's not here in Berlin.
Well, he was a keynote speaker in a conference I co-organized last year with Paul. Was one of the chairs. But so we have his talk recorded. I can actually put a link to the website. But,
and his book was very important to redefine his connection between modernism and race, and in case of Brazil, since the issues of carnival, popular culture, you know, so forth.
Yeah, I think there's so much to explore in this, beyond this kind of very narrow kind of narrative of Brazilian modernism from the 20s through the 50s, this kind of so-called kind of high modernity and Brasilia, etc., into the contemporary. I think there are kind of several branches that kind of reveal certain problematics in that kind of linear kind of narrative that are quite interesting. But I'm looking at the time, and we've been going for more than an hour and a half, and I think that's kind of around the time we kind of calculate for events. So unless anyone has any further questions, I'm going to thank you, Denilson, so much for your presentation, and I hope we kind of continue our conversations in the near future. I mean, I should have mentioned also, I should have mentioned that we did meet with Paul and Joe Kay, who's another UAL member of staff in Rio, and this invite is a kind of a consequence and hopefully the beginning of future collaborations and discussions, etc.
Oh, that's nice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Denilson. And thank you, Michael, again for your questions and your sharing. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Denilson. And yeah, let's continue the conversation.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
London. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yes, come to London. Come to London. You're always welcome.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye.
Thanks, Michael. Bye.